That was how Mara Vasquez would describe it years later, when she was old enough to sit across from a journalist without flinching. She would fold her hands on the table, look at the recorder like it was something she was deciding whether to trust, and say, "The ice spoke first, before the signal, before the object, before any of it." The ice cracked in a pattern that had no geological explanation, a long, low sound that rolled beneath the Antarctic shelf like a word in a language no human tongue had ever shaped. She heard it standing outside the drilling station at 0400, alone, with only a thermos of coffee gone cold and 47 days of nothing behind her. She was not the person anyone would have sent to listen. Mara had spent 11 years working cryptological analysis for a signals intelligence division that officially did not exist. Inside a building that officially held a mid-level telecommunications contractor in suburban Virginia. She was the kind of analyst who ate lunch at her desk, who forgot to attend her own birthday gatherings, who had once reconstructed a 600-year-old cipher from a fragment of scorched paper because the pattern bothered her, and she could not leave a pattern alone. She had been sent to Erebus Station, not because anyone believed the anomalous readings were extraterrestrial in origin, but because the readings were encoded, and no one else on the base could tell a substitution cipher from a frequency spike. She had told her supervisor she was coming back in 6 weeks. That was 14 months ago. The official story was that she had extended her contract twice. The real story was that she had decoded 3 layers of the signal in the first week, found a 4th layer that should not have existed, and quietly removed her return flight from the calendar without telling anyone. Some puzzles were too important to walk away from. Some silences, the silence of 11 billion miles of deep space, squeezed into a pattern of vibrations, locked inside a black object the size of a refrigerator. Some silences demanded an answer. She had not yet found one, but she was close. She could feel it the way you feel a word on the tip of your tongue, the shape of it without its sound. The object had been found 11 months before her arrival, during a routine ice core extraction at a depth of 400 meters. It was roughly rectangular, matte black in a way that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and completely seamless. No seams, no joins, no visible mechanism of any kind. The drilling team had stopped work and photographed it for 6 hours before anyone touched it. The first scientist to touch it reported a sensation like static electricity along the forearm. Nothing more. It did not react to heat. It did not react to magnetic fields. It did not crack, dent, or scratch under any pressure the station's equipment could generate. What it did do was transmit. Not consistently, not on a schedule. In brief, irregular pulses that the station's instruments initially mistook for atmospheric interference. Dr. Hansen, the station's lead glaciologist, had noticed the pulses were not random. Not quite. He had written a very careful email to his supervisor at NSF describing what he thought he was seeing, and his supervisor had made 3 phone calls. And within 72 hours, Mara's name had come up in a room she was not in. She had been briefed on the flight south, shown the waveform printouts, given a folder of Hansen's notes. She had been asleep for 3 hours of the 14-hour flight. The rest of the time she had been staring at the printouts with a pen in her hand, drawing connective lines between peaks, and by the time the plane dropped below, the cloud cover, and the white continent spread beneath them like a page she had not yet read, she had already dismantled Hansen's preliminary analysis and started building a better one. That was the thing about Mara. She was not arrogant. She was accurate. There was a difference, and most people conflated the two when the accurate person happened to be right. Hansen had thought the signal was a repeating sequence, a beacon, something broadcasting its own existence into the void. She understood why he thought that. The outer layer of the transmission had a clear repetitive structure, the kind of thing SETI enthusiasts imagined when they imagined first contact. A prime number sequence, a mathematical constant, a signal that said here, here, here. But it wasn't saying here. It took her 11 days to strip the first layer away cleanly. What was underneath was not repetition. It was compression. The outer layer was a key, not in the cryptographic sense, but in the musical sense. A tonal foundation that everything beneath it was built against. Once she understood what it was calibrating, she could hear the second layer the way you hear a second voice in a harmony, when you finally isolate it. The second layer was dense. Not dense like noise, dense like meaning. Like information packed so tightly that every single pulse carried multiple simultaneous channels of data, the way a single human word can carry denotation and connotation and tone and memory all at once. It took her 6 more weeks to begin parsing the second layer, And what she found there made her sit very still in her chair in the cold analysis room for a long time, staring at the wall, before she wrote anything down. It was not a greeting. It was not a welcome. It was a warning. She went to Station Commander, Director Hal Chen that afternoon, and asked for a secure channel to Washington. He asked her what she had found. She told him she needed the channel first. He studied her for a moment, the look of a man trying to decide if the slight woman in front of him was having a breakdown or a revelation, and then picked up the phone. Washington sent 3 people south within a week. 2 of them were from agencies Mara recognized. The third introduced himself as Ellison and gave no further institutional affiliation. He was tall, somewhere between 50 and 60, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending many years in rooms where the wrong movement ends conversations permanently. He wore civilian clothes that had been pressed too carefully. He shook her hand, sat down across from her analysis table, and asked her to tell him what the signal said. She told him. He listened without interrupting. He did not look surprised. That more than anything else bothered her. The signal's second layer was a warning, yes, but it was specific. It described, and she was still uncertain about the translation, still working through the conceptual scaffolding, because the language was not built on the same cognitive foundations as any human language. It described an approach, something approaching, something that had been traveling for a very long time, something that had visited before, and the last time it visited, it had not left anything standing. Ellison thanked her, said she had done exceptional work, said the matter would be handled through proper channels, said she should keep working, keep the analysis flowing, keep him updated. She kept working. She also started reading the third layer. No one had asked her to. The third layer was not part of her original brief, but the third layer was there. She could see the architecture of it, nested inside the second like a bone inside muscle, and Mara Vasquez could not look at a pattern without pulling at its edges. It was a failing her mother had told her once. Curiosity without breaks. Her mother had not meant it as a compliment. Mara had never been able to decide whether it was. The third layer took 4 months. She barely slept. She ate because Hansen brought food to the analysis room and left it on the table without comment. Because he was a careful, decent man who had worked in isolated stations long enough to recognize when someone was at the edge of something important and needed to be left alone but also fed. He did not ask what she was finding. He watched her get thinner and more focused, watched the papers accumulate on the walls in connective webs of notation, and he trusted that whatever she was doing mattered. It mattered. The third layer was not warning. The third layer was instruction. She sat with that understanding for 3 days before she told anyone. She sat with it and turned it over and stress-tested every conclusion and ran her own analysis backward from result to process, to make sure she had not made a step that felt true only because she wanted it to be true. She had a gift for that kind of ruthlessness with her own thinking. It was why she was good at what she did, and she used every gram of it now, because what the third layer said was too important to be wrong about. The object was not just a warning buoy, it was a toolkit. Whoever had left it, whatever had left it, because she was trying to hold on to the uncertainty of that pronoun, because assuming human analog was the oldest mistake in xenobiology. Whoever had left it had understood something about the species that would eventually find it. They had understood that knowledge of a threat, absent capability to address it, is not a gift, it is a sentence. And so they had packed into the third layer, not just the nature of what was coming, but a method. A physics she did not yet understand, but whose outline she could already see. A way to build something that would work against the approaching thing, the way a vaccine works against a pathogen. Not by meeting force with force, but by understanding the underlying mechanism and countering it at the root. She brought Hansen in first, because she needed someone to check her translation against, and because she trusted him, and because the trembling in her hands when she spread the new papers on the table was something she did not want to manage alone. He read in silence for a long time. Then he said quietly, "How long do we have?" She told him. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He set it down without drinking. He said, "We should tell Chen." They told Chen. Chen told Ellison. Ellison arrived within 4 days, which told Mara that he had not been far, that he had been waiting for exactly this kind of development, which meant he had expected it, which meant he knew more about the object than he had disclosed. She did not bring this up in the meeting. She kept it in the back of her mind where it would not show on her face. And she presented her findings, and she watched his face as she did. His face said nothing. She told him about the toolkit, the physics, the construction pathway. He listened, then he said, "We will need to bring in a specialized team." "The team is here," Mara said. "Hansen has a materials background. I have the linguistics. We have the machining capacity in the lower bay. We have everything we need. With respect, Dr. Vasquez, this is considerably beyond the scope of. How much time do you think a transfer and briefing cycle takes?" She kept her voice level. She had learned long ago that the voice was the first thing people judged, and that a woman's raised voice in a room full of men was processed as emotion before it was processed as argument. She did not give him raised, she gave him precise. "By the time a new team is cleared, transported, briefed, and operational, we will have lost approximately 11 weeks. According to my timeline, we don't have 11 weeks to lose." Ellison looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She had a face made for looking back. Not hostile, not aggressive, just entirely unwilling to be the one who blinked. He said, "What do you need?" She told him. What followed was the strangest 41 days of her life, which was a high bar. The lower bay of Erebus Station was normally used for equipment maintenance and frozen sample storage. They cleared it in 36 hours, working in shifts, nobody sleeping more than 4 hours at a stretch. Ellison's people brought in components she had not expected. Materials that did not appear on any requisition form she had access to, that arrived on aircraft with no visible markings and were offloaded by people who did not introduce themselves or make eye contact. She chose not to wonder about that too hard. She had a job to do. The object had, in its third layer, encoded something she had begun privately thinking of as the blueprint. It was not a blueprint in any human sense. It did not show components or dimensions or assembly sequences. It showed relationships. Mathematical relationships between frequencies, between materials, between geometries, expressed in the same compressed language as the rest of the transmission, requiring the same slow act of translation that she had spent months developing. She worked with Hansen to render the relationships into physical terms, into materials science she could understand, into engineering she could hand to the Janishits, who were now working in 12-hour rotations in the lower bay. There were errors. There were many errors. 3 attempts produced nothing, and the 4th produced something that hummed at a frequency they could feel in their teeth, but showed no other effect. After the 4th failure, Mara went to the analysis room, sat on the floor with her back against the wall, and her knees drawn up, and stayed there for an hour, not in despair. She was not built for despair. It required a relationship with hope that she'd never fully developed. She sat there because sitting was thinking, for her, and she needed to think. What was she getting wrong? She went back to the first layer, the key. She had used it as a tonal calibration, a framework. But what if it was more than that? What if the key was also, in some sense, a material instruction? Not what to build, but the state of mind, or the state of matter, in which the building had to happen. This was the kind of thought that, spoken aloud in a meeting room in Virginia, would have ended her career. Here, with 41 days gone, and the numbers in her timeline for contracting daily, she followed it. The signal had been buried in ice for a very long time. The best estimate was 90,000 years, based on the ice layer dating. Whatever had left it had known that, had accounted for the compressed, frozen, lightless duration of its waiting. And the first thing it said, the very first thing, the foundation of every layer beneath it, was not information, was not warning, was not instruction, it was a question. She had translated it as a calibration signal, a tuning fork. She had been wrong. The first layer was asking, "Are you afraid?" Not as a challenge, not as a taunt, as a genuine inquiry, as the first thing any sufficiently intelligent species would need to know about the entity receiving this message. Are you afraid? Because, if you are afraid, the rest of this will not work. Fear collapses the cognitive pathways that make the subsequent layers comprehensible. Fear is not a weakness exactly, but it is a narrowing. It makes the possible space of solutions smaller, and what the third layer required was a very large possible space. A willingness to reach for physics that did not yet exist in the receiver's vocabulary and hold it as real. Mara sat on the floor and thought about that. She was not, she decided, afraid. She had been many things in her life. Uncertain, exhausted, occasionally lonely in the specific way of people who have organized their inner life around problems rather than people. But she was not afraid of the thing that was coming. She was afraid of failing. That was different. Fear of failure was fuel when you treated it right. It was directional. It pointed at the work. She got up. She went back to the analysis room. She rebuilt the first layer's translation from the ground up. The 5th attempt, 3 days later, produced a field. It was approximately 2 meters in diameter, perfectly spherical, invisible to the naked eye, detectable only by the instruments Hansen had rigged to track it. It lasted for 9 seconds. When it collapsed, everyone in the lower bay stood very still and then started talking at once, because 9 seconds of impossible physics had just occurred in a repurposed equipment bay in Antarctica. And no one who had spent their career in the hard, resistant world of empirical science was quite prepared for the feeling of having the universe quietly demonstrate that it was larger than they had understood. Hansen caught Mara's eye across the bay. She nodded once. He exhaled like a man setting down a very heavy thing. They had 23 days left. The scaling was the hard part. The blueprint's relationships did not simply multiply when you increased the size of the components. The physics was not linear, was not even simply non-linear, was something she still did not have adequate mathematical language for. Something that sat outside the current vocabulary of human physics the way a symphony sits outside the vocabulary of a child who has only ever heard a single instrument. She worked with machinists now in real time, standing at the fabrication tables with equations on the bench beside her, adjusting tolerances and frequencies on the fly, running the mathematics in her head at a speed that made 2 of the machinists openly uncomfortable, and one of them, a compact, gray-eyed Scotsman named Brody, who had been fixing impossible machinery in impossible places for 30 years, simply grinned with a kind of professional appreciation. Brody had a habit of whistling while he worked. Old songs, the kind she half recognized without knowing their names. Once, deep into a night shift when everyone else had gone to eat, and it was just the 2 of them at the bench, she had asked him what he was whistling. He thought about it. "My grandmother used to sing it," he said. "Don't know the name. She sang it when things were bad, I think. When the fishing was bad, or the weather. Something to do with the hands. Something to keep them moving." She stood with that for a moment. Then she bent back to the work. 13 days out, Ellison told her they had received confirmation from 3 independent observational sources. The object, the approaching thing, the one the signal described, had been detected. It was real. It was on the projected trajectory. It was larger than the signal's description had indicated, which either meant the description had understated it deliberately, or she had made an error in scale translation. She hoped it was the former. She did not stop working. 8 days out, they had a device. She hesitated to call it that. Device implied an understood mechanism, and she did not fully understand it, might never fully understand it, was operating on translated principles from a physics that was not yet human physics. But it was built, it was functional at small scale, and the mathematics suggested it would scale. The mathematics had been right so far. Ellison wanted to move it. She refused. "The resonance is calibrated to this location," she said. "The ice, the depth, the geomagnetics. Moving it risks decalibrating the field parameters, and we do not have time to recalibrate. If whatever is coming does not detour around this station on approach, then we are here," Mara said. That was always a possibility. He looked at her. She looked back. He was, she thought, a man who had spent his career managing risks that other people did not know existed, and he was not accustomed to the risk management being out of his hands. She understood the feeling. She did not have the luxury of accommodating it. "There are people on this station," he said. "I'm aware. If it comes here first, this is where we need to be." She heard her own voice as if from a distance, the flatness of it, the calm that was not performance but simply the face fear makes when it has been converted into purpose. "The device needs a human operator on site. The 3rd layer is explicit about this. It requires active calibration during deployment. The mathematics changes in real time as the field interacts with the target's approach vector. A remote trigger won't work. Someone has to be here. Who?" She picked up her coffee. She looked at him over the rim. He understood. He looked away first. The last 6 days were a kind of terrible clarity. She slept in 4-hour windows and ate whatever was put in front of her and worked with the precision of someone who has run out of the ability to doubt and must now simply do. Brody was beside her for most of it. Hansen ran calculations on the 2nd terminal, cross-checking her field equations against the signal's predicted interaction parameters. Chen had told the non-essential staff they could take the emergency evacuation flight if they chose to. About half of them left. The ones who stayed didn't speak much about why. They just stayed. On the 5th day, a junior technician named Priya found Maza in the corridor at Do 202's red and handed her a thermos of tea without saying anything and walked away. It was the kindest thing anyone had done in a while. Not because it was large, but because it was exactly right. Mara stood in the corridor holding the thermos and felt, very briefly, the specific fulfillment of being seen by another person who is not trying to get anything from you. She drank the tea. She went back to work. On the morning of the final day, the ice cracked again. It was not the ice. They all knew that. The sound was the same. That long, low, rolling concussion that moved beneath the shelf like something vast shifting its weight. But the seismographs were quiet, and there was nothing geological to explain it. It was a pressure wave in the atmosphere, arriving from the direction the signal had described, at the time the signal had predicted. Mara was already at the device. It did not look like anything. That was the thing she had not been able to adequately explain to anyone who asked. What does it look like? It looked like machined metal. It looked like a cluster of rings in specific geometrical arrangements, connected by channels of material. She did not have a name, for that Brody had fabricated from a specification she had translated with considerable uncertainty. It sat on a reinforced platform in the center of the lower bay. It looked like the kind of thing a competent but confused engineering class might produce if you gave them a problem they did not fully understand. It looked like nothing. She put her hands on the calibration interface, which was also not impressive, being essentially a modified input terminal with custom firmware she and Hansen had written during a 40-hour session 3 weeks ago. And she waited. The pressure wave arrived. There was no dramatic visual, no alien ship descending from a sky torn with lightning, no beam of annihilating light. The instruments registered a field anomaly of a type that had no prior classification, a geometric distortion in the electromagnetic environment that moved toward the station like something large, moving through shallow water, displacing everything around it. The object the signal had described was not a physical body in the conventional sense. It was a process. It was what happened to matter in a particular region of space when a particular kind of energy propagated through it. A wave, not a particle. A pattern, not a thing. This was what the third layer had understood, and what Mara had spent months translating. The approaching threat was not a weapon or a ship or a life form by any human definition. It was a process of conversion. It arrived at a stellar body and converted its physical structure through a cascade of energetic interactions that would, if uninterrupted, disassemble the molecular bonds of every complex structure within a significant radius. Not destroy. Convert. The signal's language had been very precise about this distinction in a way that Mara had found, in her clearer moments, deeply unsettling. Whatever had made the object in the signal had faced this before. Had lost, apparently, everything they had been, and had left behind in ice the understanding they had purchased at that cost for whoever came next. She activated the first calibration sequence, the field that had lasted 9 seconds in the test, that small, invisible sphere of impossible physics, emerged from the device's geometry at a scale she had not been able to test, only predict. She was working in real time now, her hands moving across the input terminal, adjusting resonance parameters as the instruments fed back the field's behavior in the presence of the incoming process. The mathematics was alive. That was the only way she could describe it afterward. The equations were not static, were not solutions to be applied, were a conversation she was having with a physics that was talking back, adjusting, probing, and she was adjusting in response, finding the dynamic equilibrium that the blueprint had described in terms she could now, finally, in this extremity, feel rather than merely calculate. Brody was at the secondary terminal. He did not have her mathematics. What he had was 30 years of knowing when a machine was fighting him, and when it was working with him, of feeling in his hands and his chest. The difference between mechanical systems operating under stress and mechanical systems operating in their true alignment. He kept the physical components compensated. He did not ask questions. When something needed to be adjusted, she called the change, and he made it with a speed that had nothing to do with following instructions and everything to do with having understood, on some wordless level, what they were trying to do. Hansen was watching the field interaction on the instruments and calling readings. His voice was steady. She did not look up to check his face. The conversion process reached the station perimeter. What followed was approximately 4 minutes of the most concentrated work of Mara Vasquez's life, and she could not describe most of it afterward with any precision, not because she had lost consciousness or entered any dramatic altered state, but because the cognition required was operating at a level that did not leave clean records. It was like asking someone to describe what happened in their body during a sprint. You can describe the before and the after, but the sprint itself is below language. She worked. The field worked. The mathematics spoke, and she answered, and it answered back, and she adjusted, and it adjusted, the two of them. The human intelligence and the translated alien physics. In a rapid, precise negotiation that had no template in any human discipline she had ever studied. The conversion process stopped, not reversed, not destroyed, stopped. The instruments showed it holding at the station perimeter, interacting with the field in a way that the simulation had predicted, and that she had, in darker moments over the past weeks, allowed herself to doubt. The field was not blocking it. That was not how it worked. The field was, she did not have the right word. The field was answering it, providing the specific countercondition that the process required to continue, and that it could not obtain, so that it sat at the edge of the station's influence, like a fire held back not by water, but by the absence of fuel, unable to proceed. It held for 11 minutes. Then it began to contract. She kept the field active. She watched the instruments. She did not celebrate. She was not built for celebration in the middle of a thing. Celebration was for after, and after was not yet. The process contracted further, withdrew. The instruments tracked it moving away from the station, on a vector that matched the signal's predicted retreat behavior, with an accuracy that made Hansen, who had been steady through everything, make a small, broken sound that she understood was not distress. When the instruments showed clear, when the field anomaly had passed beyond the detection range of every instrument they had, moving away from the planet at a velocity that strained the equipment's ability to track. Mara took her hands off the terminal. She looked at them, her hands. The knuckles were white and she had not noticed. Brody at the secondary terminal sat back in his chair and began to laugh. Not a manic laugh, not a release of terror, a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from the place in a person that finds the world, even in its worst moments, genuinely funny. He laughed for about 15 seconds and then stopped and ran a hand over his face. "Right," he said. "Cup of tea, then." Hansen was writing something. She watched him write it. A full page of calculations, cross-referencing the field interaction data against the signal's predicted values, and she knew what he was going to find before he found it. The correlation was almost perfect, 94.7%. The translation had been accurate. The blueprint had been accurate. The small, careful, frightened intelligence that had lost everything and distilled its final understanding into a black object buried in ice for 90,000 years. Trusting that something would eventually find it and be capable of using it. That intelligence had been accurate. She thought about them, not for long. She was not, by inclination, a sentimental person. Sentiment required a relationship with the past that she had never fully developed, living so consistently in the work, in the present tense of whatever problem was before her. But she thought about them for a moment. Whatever they had been, moving through a universe that was not as safe as it appeared, finding the thing that ended them, finding it too late to save themselves, and choosing, in that ending, to leave something for whoever came next. There was no word for that, no human word. Sacrifice required a future self who chose not to survive. These had been a species, or something like a species, facing a process of conversion that left nothing with which to make yourselves. And they had compressed what they knew into ice and sent it forward anyway, through 90,000 years of dark, to whatever hands might eventually be capable of receiving it. She picked up Priya's thermos, still faintly warm. Ellison came into the lower bay 20 minutes later. He looked at the device, he looked at the instruments, he looked at Mara. His face was doing something unfamiliar with itself. "It worked," he said. "It worked," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "There will be significant, there are implications as to what you've translated. The physics alone. I know, the technology, the applications beyond. I know." She set the thermos down. "That's for later. That's for all the very important meetings with all the very important people." She said it without sharpness. It was simply true. "Right now I'm going to go outside." He looked at her. "Outside?" "It's a clear day," she said. "I haven't been outside in 6 days. I want to see the sky." He had nothing to say to that. The cold hit her as always. That specific Antarctic cold that was not just temperature but a quality of the air. A stripped-down clarity that made everything feel very precise and very real. The sky was the color of bone at the horizon, and deepened overhead to a blue that had no name in any language she knew. The ice extended in every direction, flat and immense, broken only by the structures of the station behind her. She stood there for a long time. The ice had spoken first. Whatever had come for them, the process, the conversion, the thing with no name in human science, had arrived and found a small cluster of heated buildings on a frozen continent, and had encountered, Of all the things it might have encountered, a woman who could not leave a pattern alone. She thought about the question in the first layer. Are you afraid? She had not been afraid of it. She had been afraid of getting it wrong. She had been afraid of the pattern not yielding, of the translation being imprecise, of the blueprint containing something she lacked the cognitive framework to receive. She had been afraid of the specific failure that would mean the thing in the ice had waited 90,000 years for a species that was not yet capable of meeting it. They had been capable. It still surprised her. It shouldn't have. She knew what humans could do when the problem was clear, and the stakes were absolute, and the work was right in front of them. She had watched Brody at the secondary terminal, compensating by feel for mechanical behaviors that had no theoretical basis. And she had watched Hansen call readings for 4 minutes in a voice that betrayed nothing. And she had watched Priya appear in a corridor at 0200 with exactly the right thing, and no demand for credit. She knew what her species was capable of. It still surprised her. She turned her face up toward the sky, that deep, nameless blue, and stood there in the cold that cleaned everything it touched, and she breathed. Somewhere in the ice below her, the object was silent now. It had said what it needed to say. Whether it had more to say, whether there were layers below the third that she had not yet found, she did not know. She would find out. That was, in the end, the most human thing about her. Not the intelligence, not the pattern recognition, not the ruthlessness with her own assumptions. Those were skills. What was human was the inability to look at the remaining mystery and walk away. The certainty, sitting low in the chest like a coal that would not cool, that the next question was already there, already waiting, already hers. She went back inside. She had work to do. The debriefing lasted 3 weeks. They flew her north on the same unmarked aircraft that had delivered Ellison's components, and this time she slept for 11 hours of the flight. A deep, dreamless sleep, the kind the body demands when it has been running on something beyond ordinary fuel, and the something has finally been spent. She woke over the Southern Ocean with a blanket she didn't remember pulling over herself, and a sandwich wrapped in paper on the armrest, beside her. And Brody asleep 2 seats forward with his head against the window, his breath fogging the glass in slow rhythmic clouds. She ate the sandwich. She watched the water below. They had won. The word felt insufficient. Winning implied with rules and a scoreboard. Implied opponents who understood they were in a contest. The process had not been an opponent in any meaningful sense. It had been a natural phenomenon, catastrophic, extinction level, as indifferent as a hurricane, and what they had done was not win but survive, which was an older word and a heavier one. The first debriefing was with Ellison and 3 people she hadn't met. They were in a room that had been cleared of everything except a long table and 6 chairs, in a building in a city she was told was not the city she was in. She had stopped pushing on those kinds of institutional absurdities years ago. You learned, working in the layers she had worked in, that the geography of official secrecy was less a conspiracy than a habit. A long accumulation of procedural choices made by people who had been told that opacity was safety until they could no longer tell the difference between protecting information and hoarding it. She told them everything. She had decided somewhere over the Southern Ocean that she would tell them everything, hold nothing back, perform no strategic ambiguity. It was not naivety. She understood perfectly well that the information she held was the most significant intelligence acquisition in human history, and that there were many interests in that room that were not identical with her own. She told them everything anyway, because the alternative, the incremental calibrated release of information for personal or institutional advantage, was precisely the behavior that would ensure the next encounter with something like the conversion process would go the other way. You did not play leverage games with information that might be the difference between the species surviving and the species being quietly unmade. Ellison, to his credit, understood what she was doing. She could see it in his face across the table. A recalibration, a reassessment of the woman he thought he'd been managing since he first sat down across from her in Antarctica and found himself unexpectedly managed. He was smart enough to respect it. That helped. The questions went for 6 hours. She answered all of them. When they asked things she didn't know, she said she didn't know, and described exactly what she would need to find out. When they asked things that edged toward weaponization of the device's principles, she answered those too, not because she was comfortable with it, but because she had learned. In 11 years of working with classified information, That the decision about what humans would do with a capability was never actually made in the room where the capability was first disclosed. It was made later, in other rooms by other people, and her withholding in this room would change almost nothing about that process, and would simply replace her as a variable with someone less likely to insist on the full context. She insisted on the full context. That was what she could do. On the third day of the debriefings, they brought in a physicist doctor. Yuan was about 60, small and precise in her movements, with the particular quality of attention that Mara recognized from mirrors. Someone who was always doing more than one thing in her head and had long since stopped apologizing for it. She had been read in on the signal data the night before. She came in with 12 pages of handwritten notes. They spent 4 hours together. At the end of it, Yuan set her pen down and said, in a voice that was very careful and very flat, "You understand what this means." "I understand several things it might mean," Mara said. "Which one are you asking about?" A slight, genuine smile. "The propulsion implications. Yes, the materials alone. Yes, the field geometry. If that scales. If the interaction principles." "They do," Mara said. "Scaling is nonlinear, but the architecture holds. I have 12 weeks of working mathematics, most of which is in my head, and the rest of which is on a wall in Erebus Station's analysis room. I've been thinking about how to reconstruct it in a more durable format." She paused. "I'll need a good whiteboard setup, and someone who can keep up." Yoon looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained several things, the most prominent of which was the particular hunger of a scientist who has just seen the edge of a territory she has spent her entire career approaching without ever reaching. "I can keep," said. They worked together for the next 2 weeks. What they built in those 2 weeks, the reconstructed mathematics, the theoretical framework, the bridge between the alien physics and the human physics vocabulary they were constructing to receive it, was not a finished thing. It was a beginning, a very large beginning, the kind that has its own gravity, that draws other minds toward it and accelerates as it grows. Mara had not thought much, in the intensity of the preceding months, about what came after. After had felt like a problem for someone else, for the people who lived in the future she was trying to ensure existed. Now it was the present tense, and she was in it, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was not uncomfortable. It was interesting. Extraordinarily interesting. The translated physics was not just a solution to a specific threat. It was a window into a way of understanding the universe that human science had not previously had access to. And what you could see through that window was vast and strange, and fundamentally exciting, in the way that only genuine discovery is exciting. The way that made the fatigue and the fear and the 41 days of impossible work feel not like costs but like investments that had paid out. She was not done. That was the most human thing about this moment, she thought, writing at the long table in the cleared room, with Yuan beside her, and the whiteboard covered in notation that neither of them had been able to write 6 months ago. She was not done. They had survived one thing, translated one object, countered one process. The universe was very large. The signal had described what was coming, but had not described what else might be out there. What other processes, what other objects buried in what other ice, on what other frozen margins of inhabited worlds, waiting for hands capable of finding and opening them. There was more to learn. There was always more. On the last day of the formal debriefing, Ellison walked her to the building's exit. A small, unusual gesture, the kind that meant something without quite being able to say what. They stood at the door for a moment in the gray morning light of a city she officially wasn't in. "What happens now?" he said. Not a question, exactly. Something between a question and an acknowledgement that the answer was larger than any single conversation. "Now we learn what we learned," she said. "Properly this time. With time and adequate sleep and people who can check our work." He nodded. There was something behind his face that she had not seen there before. Not quite gratitude, not quite relief. Something older than both of those. Something that looked, in an angle of gray light, a lot like awe. She shook his hand. She walked out. The city was cold. Not Antarctic cold, not that stripped down, bone-deep precision of the end of the world. But an ordinary cold, the cold of a morning, in a place where things were happening, where people were moving between buildings with their hands in their pockets and their breath rising in small clouds. A street vendor in the corner was selling coffee. The smell reached her from 20 meters away. She bought a cup. She stood on the corner and drank it, and watched the city move around her. These several million people going about their ordinary lives in complete ignorance of the fact that, 41 days ago, the on a frozen continent at the far end of the world. A woman who couldn't leave a pattern alone had answered a 90,000-year-old question and kept the planet from becoming something else. They did not know. They would probably never know. Not in any complete sense. The full story would move through classification layers and institutional caution, and the general human tendency to doubt the things that most urgently need to be believed. And what would emerge eventually into public knowledge would be incomplete and distorted and disputed. That was fine. It was fine because they were here to dispute it. They were here, these several million people with their ordinary mornings and their coffee and their lives. And they were here because of work done in a lower bay, in Erebus Station. And they would go on being here. And that was the only thing that had ever actually mattered. She finished the coffee. She took out her notebook, an old paper one, the kind she had carried since her first posting, the kind she had filled with notation and crossed out hypotheses, and the occasional margin sketch of something she was trying to think through. And she opened it to the first blank page. The object in the ice was silent now. She was fairly sure it was silent now. But the third layer had been the last she had fully translated, and there might be a fourth, and if there was a fourth, there might be a fifth. And the field interaction during the counter-deployment had shown 3 anomalies she had not had time to interrogate, anomalies that sat in the back of her mind the way unsolved patterns always sat. Pressing gently against the walls of her attention, she wrote 3 lines. The first was a question. The second was a process for approaching the question. The third was a note to herself, 3 words, the kind of note she had learned to write when she was very young, and had not yet understood that the problems she was drawn to were the kind that never quite ended. Keep going, Mara. She closed the notebook. She put it in her jacket pocket. She turned and walked into the city, into the morning, into the very large and very interesting question of what came next. The ice had spoken first. It was not done speaking. She was certain of that now with the same certainty she had brought to the mathematics in the lower bay. The quiet, unshowy conviction of someone who has spent enough time with hard problems to recognize when one is the beginning of a larger problem and not its end. Something had built that object. Something had survived what was coming, or come close to surviving, close enough to understand it and compress the understanding and send it forward. Something, some intelligence, some form of organized knowing, had done what she had done, faced the unclassified dark and refused to leave the pattern alone. She wanted to find them. Not the process, not the threat, them. Whoever had built the object and buried it in ice, whatever they had been. The city moved around her. People drank coffee. A dog walked a man on a leash, the dog certain and purposeful, the man tolerant. 2 children argued about something. Music came from a window above her, something she almost misrecognized. She walked, she thought. She carried the notebook in her pocket like a compass, pointing at the next question. She had work to do.